Welcome, weary traveler. Tonight the fire burns low, the stars hang silent overhead, and the road at last grows quiet. But before sleep takes you, let us listen to the voice of one who walked every path and kept more secrets than he ever shared. This is the tale Gandalf never told. A collection of stories lost in the folds of time, whispered only in passing or kept close behind the wizard's steady gaze. For while Gandalf the Grey guided heroes and shaped the fate of Middle-earth, much of what he knew remained unspoken until now. So close your eyes. Let the hush of elvish woodlands, the soft hum of dwarven forges, and the distant cry of eagles cradle you into stillness. These are stories he might have told if the road had been longer and the night just a little more kind. In the vast expanse of Middle-earth, there are tales that even the wisest do not speak of. Stories buried beneath the weight of more pressing concerns, of rings and dark lords and the fate of kingdoms. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments between great events, when the fire burns low and minds turn to wonder, these forgotten tales surface like ancient bones from thawing ground. This is one such story. A tale Gandalf the Grey never told. The dream came to Gandalf as he rested beneath the eaves of Mirkwood, in that brief respite between investigations of Dol Guldur. For weeks, he had been probing the edges of the dark fortress, sensing the malevolent presence that dwelled within, yet unable to confirm his growing suspicions. Exhaustion had finally claimed him, and he had sought shelter with a woodsman who lived in the forest's western margins. Sleep had come swiftly, but it brought no peace. In his dream, Gandalf stood upon a vast plain of ice that stretched endlessly in all directions. The cold was absolute, a piercing chill that seemed to reach beyond flesh and into the very spirit. Above him, the sky was a canvas of shimmering lights, greens and blues and violets dancing across the heavens. Beautiful, yet somehow foreboding. Then came the shadow, a vast darkness moving beneath the ice, causing the frozen surface to buckle and crack. It moved with purpose, circling Gandalf like a predator stalking its prey. And as it drew closer, the wizard heard a voice, ancient and terrible, speaking words in a language that had not been uttered since the elder days. Olorin, it called, using his true name, the name he bore in Valinor before taking form as Gandalf. The cold awakens. The sleeper stirs. Come north. Gandalf tried to speak, to demand the shadow reveal itself, but no words came. The ice beneath his feet began to splinter, and as he looked down, he saw not his reflection, but the face of a man gaunt and desperate, his beard crusted with frost, his eyes pleading. North, the face whispered. Come north. Gandalf awoke with a start, his heart pounding. The fire in the woodsman's hut had burned low, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees of Mirkwood. But to Gandalf, it seemed to carry the same message. North. Come north. He knew then that his investigation of Dol Guldur would have to wait. Something called him to the northern wastes, the desolate region beyond the Grey Mountains, where few ventured and fewer returned. Something ancient and dangerous had awakened, and if left unchecked, it might prove as great a threat as the shadow growing in the south. By morning, Gandalf had gathered his meager possessions and set out, leaving behind a puzzled host and a message for Radagast should he come looking. The brown wizard would understand the urgency, if not the cause. Beyond the forest lay the Grey Mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist and snow even in the height of summer. Gandalf knew these mountains well, having crossed them many times in his wanderings. But this time, as he navigated the treacherous passes, he felt a growing sense of dread, a cold certainty that something waited for him on the other side. The journey was long and arduous. Gandalf traveled first to the eastern slopes of the Misty Mountains, then followed the Anduin northward until he reached the Forest River. From there he made his way through the northern reaches of Mirkwood, where the trees grew twisted and hostile and the air hung heavy with malice. As Gandalf journeyed northward, the dream continued to haunt him. The face in the ice, the voice calling his true name. These were no ordinary dream visions. Something was reaching out to him specifically, and that troubled him deeply. Few beings in Middle-earth knew him as Olorin. Fewer still had the power to touch his mind from afar. It was in the foothills north of the mountains that Gandalf encountered the first signs of trouble. A small settlement of Northmen lay abandoned, its buildings intact but devoid of life. No bodies, no signs of struggle. The people had simply vanished, leaving meals half-eaten on tables and tools dropped mid-task. In the center of the village square stood a crude marker, a pole topped with the skull of a great bear, facing north. And carved into the pole were runes in an ancient script that even Gandalf struggled to decipher. When at last he understood their meaning, his blood ran cold. The ice drake wakes. The shadow spreads. Flee south or join the Taken. 2 days later, Gandalf reached another settlement. This one still inhabited, though barely. A wooden palisade surrounded a cluster of sturdy longhouses, and grim-faced men patrolled the walls, clutching spears with white-knuckled hands. They greeted Gandalf with suspicion, lowering their weapons only when he identified himself as a friend of Grimbearn, the old chieftain of the Beornings to the south. Grimbearn's name still carries weight here, said the settlement's leader, a broad-shouldered man named Halmar. Though we've had little contact with our southern kin these past months. The passes are too dangerous. Halmar led Gandalf to the largest of the longhouses, where a fire burned in the central hearth, casting flickering light on the worried faces of the gathered Northmen. They were a hardy people, descendants of those who had fled north after the fall of the kingdom of Rovanion. Life on the edge of the northern waste had made them tough and resilient. Yet now Gandalf saw fear in their eyes. It began with the dreams, Halmar explained as they sat before the fire, sharing a meal of salted meat and hard bread. Dreams of ice and shadow. Then came the disappearances. First lone hunters who didn't return, then entire families. We've lost 3 settlements in as many months. And you found no trace of them? Gandalf asked, though he already suspected the answer. Nothing, Halmar replied. It's as if they simply walked into the snow and vanished. His voice dropped to a whisper. But there are tracks, sometimes. Not of men or beasts, but of something that drags itself across the ice, leaving a trail of frost even on the warmest days. Yet someone must have returned, or you wouldn't know of the danger, Gandalf observed. Halmar's head snapped up, his eyes wide. How do you know of that? I have my ways, Gandalf said, not wishing to reveal the true nature of his dreams. Is it far? Halmar was silent for a long moment. Then he rose and crossed to a chest in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. Carefully, he unwrapped it to reveal a sword, or what remained of one. The blade was shattered halfway down its length, and what remained was blackened as if burned. Strange runes ran along the broken edge, glowing faintly in the firelight. 3 days' journey north, in the heart of the waste, Halmar said, his voice heavy with grief. An ancient place, half buried in ice. The elders say it was built before the coming of men to these lands. No one goes there, wizard. Those who have tried never returned. He leaned forward, his voice urgent. My son led a party of our strongest warriors to the fortress after the second settlement vanished. This is all that came back, delivered to our gates by a man half-mad with frostbite and fear. He died before he could tell us what happened. But his eyes... Halmar shuddered. I've seen men die before, wizard. I've seen fear and pain and despair. But I've never seen a man's eyes emptied of their very soul. Gandalf took the broken sword, running his fingers along the runes. They were pre-Númenórean, similar to those used in Beleriand during the First Age. The metal, too, was unusual, lighter than steel, but seemingly just as strong despite its damaged state. This was not made by men, he murmured. No, Halmar agreed. The elders say it comes from the time when the cold drakes first came from the north, and the dwarves of the Grey Mountains made weapons to fight them. Gandalf's eyebrows rose. The cold drakes were a lesser breed of dragon, lacking the fire and much of the intelligence of their greater kin like Smaug. But they were dangerous nonetheless, with scales like iron and breath that could freeze a man solid in seconds. Most had been slain or driven into the uttermost north thousands of years ago. You believe a cold drake is responsible for the disappearances? He asked. Halmar shook his head. Not a drake. Something worse. Something that commands the cold itself. He met Gandalf's gaze steadily. The elders call it Nargul, the ice shadow. They say it is as old as the mountains themselves, a spirit of winter and darkness that sleeps for centuries at a time, waking only when it hungers. And you believe it has awakened now? Gandalf felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The name was unfamiliar to him, but the description matched all too well the shadow he had seen moving beneath the ice in his dream. "I know it has," Halmar replied. "And I fear that unless it is stopped, its hunger will spread beyond the waste. Already the winters grow longer and colder as far south as the Anduin. Game grows scarce. The very air seems to leach the warmth from our bodies. We are leaving, wizard," he continued, "taking what we can carry and heading south before the passes close completely." "When do you depart?" Gandalf asked. "At first light. You are welcome to join us." Gandalf shook his head. "My path leads north." Halmar's expression was grim but unsurprised. "Then you go to your death, wizard. But if by some miracle you survive and defeat this thing, know that you will have the eternal gratitude of my people." As the flames danced, Gandalf found his thoughts turning to the White Council and its preoccupation with the growing shadow in the south. Saruman, in particular, had dismissed Gandalf's concerns about Dol Guldur, insisting that the enemy had been destroyed forever. What would the White Wizard make of this new threat from the north? Would he dismiss it as well, as merely a local concern unworthy of the Council's attention? In truth, it mattered little what Saruman would think. Gandalf had been sent to Middle-earth to oppose the enemy in all his forms, not just the obvious ones. If this Nargul was indeed as ancient and powerful as Halmar believed, then it could not be ignored. Especially if, as Gandalf suspected, it was no natural creature, but a spirit of malice, perhaps even one of the lesser Mayor corrupted by Morgoth in the elder days. That night, as the settlement prepared for its exodus, Gandalf sat alone by the fire, pondering what he had learned. The broken sword lay before him, its runes still glowing faintly. He had tried various spells to discern its nature and origin, but the magic that had forged it was strange to him. Neither elven nor dwarfish, though it contained elements of both. His decision made, Gandalf rose and began to prepare for the journey ahead. He would need supplies, warmer clothing, and a guide, someone who knew the wasteland and could lead him to the fortress. Finding such a person would not be easy, given the Northmen's fear. But Gandalf had long experience in persuading reluctant allies. As he moved through the settlement, gathering what he needed, Gandalf became aware of a presence following him, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows between buildings. He gave no sign that he had noticed, continuing his preparations until he reached a secluded spot near the northern wall. Then, without warning, he whirled around, staff raised. "Show yourself," he commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his power. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a figure stepped forward, a man tall and lean, with a wild mane of dark hair and a beard streaked with premature gray. He wore furs and leathers, and at his belt hung a long knife of curious design. But it was his eyes that caught Gandalf's attention, pale blue, almost colorless, with a feral intensity that reminded the wizard of the great wolves that roamed the northern wilds. "You seek a guide," the man said. It was not a question. "I do," Gandalf replied, lowering his staff slightly but remaining wary. "You offer your services?" "I am Grimbeorn, son of Beorn," the man said, inclining his head. Gandalf's eyebrows rose in surprise. He had known Beorn well, the skin changer who had aided Thorin Oakenshield's company in their quest to reclaim Erebor. Beorn had been a solitary figure, mistrustful of strangers and preferring the company of animals to men. That he had sired a son was unexpected news. "Your father never spoke of you," Gandalf said carefully. "We parted ways many years ago." Grimbeorn's gaze was steady. "He did not approve of my choice to live among men. Yet you bear his name." "I honor what he taught me, even if our paths diverged," Grimbeorn replied. "I know the wasteland better than any man alive. I can lead you to the fortress and to Nargul." "Why would you do this?" Gandalf asked. "The others flee south." "I have my reasons," Grimbeorn said, his hand moving unconsciously to a pouch at his belt. "Let us say that I have a debt to settle with the creature that dwells in the ice." A shadow passed over Grimbeorn's face. "We parted ways many years ago. He did not approve of my choice to live among men." Gandalf studied him thoughtfully. There was more to this offer than simple guidance, he sensed. "Very well," Gandalf nodded slowly. He did not entirely trust this wild-eyed son of Beorn, but he needed a guide, and time was short. We leave at dawn, before the others. I would prefer our departure go unnoticed. Grimbeorn's lips curved in what might have been a smile. As would I, wizard. As would I. In the morning, they would journey into the heart of winter, seeking a shadow that devoured light and life. And Gandalf would face a power perhaps as ancient as himself, a fragment of the primordial darkness that had existed before Arda was formed. The thought should have filled him with dread. Instead, he felt a strange anticipation. For too long he had been playing a game of shadows with the enemy, never confronting him directly. This, at least, was a foe he could face openly, without the constraints of his mission or the politics of the White Council. Dawn broke cold and gray over the settlement as Gandalf and Grimbeorn slipped through a small gate in the northern wall. No farewells were exchanged. The Northmen were too busy with their own preparations for Exodus to notice the departure of the wizard and his strange guide. The land changed quickly as they journeyed northward. The sparse forests and rolling hills gave way to a barren tundra where only the hardiest plants clung to life in the shelter of rocks. The wind grew sharper, carrying the bite of ice and the promise of worse to come. They traveled light, each carrying only what could be borne on their backs. Gandalf had his staff, Glamdring, and a small pack containing provisions and a few items of power that might prove useful against the darkness ahead. Grimbeorn carried a larger pack along with a bough of horn and yew and the long knife at his belt. He moved with the fluid grace of his father, covering ground with long loping strides that Gandalf sometimes struggled to match. They spoke little during that first day, each lost in his own thoughts. It was only as they made camp in the lee of a great boulder, with a small fire of dried moss and dwarf willow to ward off the chill, that Grimbeorn finally broke his silence. "You are not what I expected," he said, studying Gandalf across the flames. "Oh." Gandalf raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect?" "My father spoke of a meddlesome old man who was more than he seemed, but he did not mention your power. I can sense it, you know, like the air before a storm." Grimbeorn's pale eyes reflected the firelight. "Your father was a perceptive man, but not given to flowery descriptions. I am exactly what I appear to be, a wandering wizard who perhaps involves himself too much in the affairs of others." "A wizard," Grimbeorn repeated, as if tasting the word. "We have tales of your kind in the north, the Istari, sent from across the sea to guide and counsel. But the tales also say there were 5 of you, yet few have ever seen more than 2 or 3. The others have their own tasks and territories," Gandalf said carefully. In truth, he had not seen Alatar or Palando, the blue wizards, since they had journeyed into the east centuries ago, and Radagast rarely ventured far from his beloved forests. Only Saruman moved widely through the western lands, though even he had become increasingly reclusive in recent years, sequestered in his tower at Isengard. Grimbeorn seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. "And what is your task, wizard? Why do you alone among your order concern yourself with this northern threat?" Gandalf puffed thoughtfully on his pipe before answering. "I go where I am needed, where the shadow threatens to grow unchecked. The north has been neglected too long, I fear." "The neglect has cost many lives," Grimbeorn said, his eyes flashing. "Not just men, but beasts as well. The great bears that my father's people revered are all but gone from these lands, driven south, or—" He trailed off, his hand again moving to the pouch at his belt. "Or taken by Nargul," Gandalf finished for him. "You've encountered this creature before." Grimbeorn's eyes grew distant, seeing not the small campfire before him, but the memory of that desolate place. "2 winters passed. I led a hunting party into the waste. We sought white wolves that had been raiding the settlements. There were 5 of us, all experienced hunters, men who had survived decades in this harsh land." He drew a deep breath. "We found no wolves. Instead, we stumbled upon a valley where nothing lived. No plants, no animals, not even insects. The very air seemed dead, frozen in place." For a long moment, Grimbeorn was silent, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was low and tight with controlled emotion. In the center of the valley stood a pillar of ice, taller than 10 men. And within the ice were shapes, human shapes, and animals too, all perfectly preserved, their faces contorted in terror. He swallowed hard. We should have fled then, but curiosity overcame caution. We approached the pillar, and as we did, the ice began to melt, not from heat, for there was none, but as if the solid form simply decided to become liquid. Gandalf leaned forward, his pipe forgotten. What emerged? Shadow, Grimbeorn whispered. Living darkness that moved with purpose and malice. It flowed around us like water, cutting off escape. The others panicked, tried to run. I saw them freeze in mid-stride, the life literally sucked from their bodies. Their skin turned blue, then white, then transparent as ice formed in their veins. He reached for the pouch at his belt, finally withdrawing its contents, a small carved figure of a bear made from what appeared to be a single piece of amber. Within the amber, something dark swirled and shifted like smoke trapped in glass. I would have died with them, but for this, my father's last gift to me. He said it contained a spark of his spirit, a protection against the cold and dark. Grimbeorn's fingers closed around the talisman. It burned in my hand as the shadow enveloped me, blazing with a light and heat that drove the creature back. I ran, and it did not pursue, perhaps injured, perhaps simply unwilling to leave its territory. I never knew. Gandalf reached out, his expression grave. May I? After a moment's hesitation, Grimbeorn placed the amber bear in Gandalf's palm. The wizard felt it immediately, a pulse of wild magic, primal and untamed, yet fundamentally good. Beorn's essence indeed, or at least a portion of it, preserved through some innate power the skin changer had possessed. A remarkable gift, Gandalf said softly, returning the talisman. Your father's power was greater than even he knew, I think. Grimbeorn tucked the bear back into its pouch. It saved my life, but it did not save my companions, nor the others who have been taken since. His eyes hardened. I returned to the valley many times, seeking a way to destroy the creature. But the pillar of ice was gone, and with it, Nargul, until now. What changed? Gandalf asked. The dreams began, Grimbeorn said simply. Not just mine, but everyone's. Dreams of ice and shadow and a voice calling from the north. And then the disappearances started again, but on a scale never seen before. Entire settlements vanishing overnight. Gandalf nodded grimly. It matched his own experience, the dream that had called him north, using his true name. But why now? What had awakened this ancient evil after what must have been centuries of dormancy? Or someone, Gandalf thought, but did not say. Could his own presence in the north, his investigations of Dol Guldur, have somehow awakened this creature? Or was there some other power at work? Perhaps even the enemy himself, reaching out from the shadows to set another piece on the board? As if reading his thoughts, Grimbeorn said, the elders believe Nargul wakes only when it senses great power it can consume to grow stronger. They say it fed on the dragons in ancient days, and later on the great bears of the north. Now, perhaps it has sensed something new. These questions would have to wait, for now they needed rest, if they were to continue their journey at first light. We should sleep, Gandalf said, banking the fire. The path grows harder from here. Grimbeorn nodded, wrapping himself in his furs. I will take first watch. The creatures of the waste grow bold at night. As Gandalf settled onto the cold ground, he found his thoughts turning once more to the White Council and what they would make of this threat. Saruman would dismiss it, certainly, as a local matter of little consequence to their greater concerns. Galadriel might be more receptive, but her power was focused on Lothlorien and the protection of her realm. And Elrond had his hands full maintaining Rivendell as the last homely house east of the sea. No, this was Gandalf's task alone, as so many tasks seemed to be in these latter days. The burden of vigilance fell heavily on his shoulders, but he would bear it as he always had, with determination, and when possible, good humor. With that thought, he drifted into a light sleep, his dreams troubled by shadows moving beneath the ice and a voice that called his true name. The next day brought them deeper into the wasteland. The temperature dropped steadily as they traveled, until even Gandalf, with his resistance to extremes of heat and cold, felt the bite of the Arctic air. Grimbeorn seemed less affected, moving with the same tireless grace despite the conditions. By midday, they had reached a vast plain of ice, a frozen lake or sea stretching to the horizon. The surface was unnaturally smooth, like polished glass reflecting the pale sky above. Gandalf studied the expanse with a weary eye. How solid is the ice? Solid enough to bear our weight, if we're careful, Grimbearn said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. But that's not what concerns me. He pointed to the center of the frozen plain, where a faint darkness seemed to stain the ice, a shadow that hadn't been there before. Nargul, he murmured. Yes, Grimbearn confirmed. It waits for us. Gandalf narrowed his eyes, focusing his sight beyond the physical realm. What he saw made his blood run cold. The darkness was not a stain, but a presence, a malevolent consciousness that dwelled beneath the ice, vast and ancient and hungry. Then we shall not disappoint it, Gandalf said, gripping his staff firmly. But we will approach with caution. This creature has existed for millennia. It will have patience and cunning to match its malice. They began their crossing, moving slowly and deliberately across the treacherous surface. The ice creaked and groaned beneath their feet, but held firm. As they advanced, Gandalf became aware of a subtle change in the air, a deepening of the cold until it seemed to penetrate to the bone, and a quality of stillness that was not natural. It knows we're here, Grimbearn whispered, his hand moving to the amber talisman at his belt. Stay close, Gandalf nodded grimly. Whatever happens, do not let it separate us. They had reached perhaps the midpoint of their crossing when the attack came, not from the darkness ahead, but from the ice beneath their feet. With a sound like shattering glass, the surface buckled and split, sending both wizard and guide scrambling for purchase on the suddenly unstable footing. Jump! Gandalf shouted as a fissure opened between them, widening rapidly. Grimbearn leaped across the gap, landing heavily beside Gandalf. But even as they regained their footing, the ice continued to fracture around them, breaking into smaller and smaller pieces until they stood on a single floe, adrift in a sea of black water that had no business being liquid in such cold. And from that water rose the shadow, not of physical form, but a darkness deeper than night, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than merely block it. It surrounded their small island of ice, circling slowly, deliberately. Gandalf raised his staff, its crystal tip blazing with white light. I come not as prey, but as adversary, he replied in the same tongue. Return to your slumber, spirit of winter, or face the fire of the west. Olorin, it said, the voice the same as in Gandalf's dream, ancient and terrible, speaking a language that had not been heard in Middle-earth since before the rising of the sun. At last you come to me. A sound like laughter emanated from the shadow, though it held no mirth. Fire! Here, in my domain. You are far from your power, Maya. Here the cold reigns supreme. As if to demonstrate, the temperature plummeted further. The black water began to freeze again, but not in the natural way of ice forming on the surface. Instead, spears of ice shot upward from the depths, surrounding their flow with a forest of crystalline blades. Grimbearn drew his knife, though what good steel would do against such a foe, Gandalf could not guess. The skin changer's face was set in grim determination, his free hand clutching the amber bear. We cannot fight it here, he said low. We need to reach the fortress. Gandalf nodded, his mind racing. The fortress, what significance did it hold? Was it merely Nargul's lair, or was there something there that could be used against the creature? There was no time to ponder. The ice spears were closing in, threatening to impale them where they stood. With a word of power, Gandalf struck his staff against the ice beneath their feet. A shockwave radiated outward, shattering the deadly spears and clearing a path through the refreezing water. Run, he commanded. Together they sprinted across the unstable surface, leaping from floe to floe as the shadow pursued. The far shore seemed impossibly distant, but Gandalf dared not look back. He could feel the cold at his heels, reaching for him with fingers of ice that sought to steal his warmth and freeze his blood. Beside him, Grimbearn ran with the preternatural speed of his kind, the amber talisman glowing visibly through the leather of its pouch. They were perhaps halfway to shore when disaster struck. A tendril of darkness shot ahead of them, freezing the water in their path, not into solid ice, but into a slick, frictionless surface. Grimbearn hit it first, his feet sliding out from under him. He fell hard, his momentum carrying him toward the edge of the ice and the black water beyond. Gandalf lunged, catching the skin changer's arm just as he began to slide over the edge. For a moment they teetered on the brink. Then Gandalf planted his staff firmly and pulled with all his strength, dragging Grimbeorn back to relative safety. "Your light fades, Olorin," Nargul taunted. "Soon you will join the others, preserved forever in my embrace. Your power feeding mine for eternity." But the delay had cost them. The shadow was upon them now, surrounding them completely, its cold so intense that Gandalf could feel his power waning, his very thoughts slowing as the chill penetrated his being. Gandalf straightened, drawing himself up to his full height. Though he appeared as an old man to the eyes of Middle-earth, in this moment something of his true nature shone through, a spirit of fire and light, a servant of the secret fire that Morgoth had sought in vain to extinguish. "I am a wielder of the flame of Aenir," he declared, his voice ringing with power. "You cannot extinguish me, creature of darkness." With those words, Gandalf raised his staff high and brought it down with tremendous force. The crystal at its tip flared with a light so bright it seemed to pierce the very heavens. And where it touched the shadow, Nargul recoiled with a shriek of rage and pain. In that moment of distraction, Gandalf seized Grimbeorn's arm. "Now, to the shore!" They ran as they had never run before, the light of Gandalf's staff holding the shadow at bay just long enough for them to reach the solid ground of the far shore. As they scrambled up the icy bank, Gandalf turned to face the frozen expanse once more. The shadow had retreated to the center of the ice, but it had not fled. It waited watching, its malevolence a palpable force even at this distance. "It will come for us again," Grimbeorn said, his breath ragged. "And it will be stronger next time. Your light hurt it, but did not destroy it." "No," Gandalf agreed grimly. "That was but a skirmish, not the battle. For that, we need to reach the fortress." They turned away from the frozen plain and continued their journey northward, the shadow's laughter echoing in their minds long after it had faded from their ears. As the weak northern sun began its early descent toward the horizon, the fortress loomed before them, a massive structure of black stone, half buried in ice and snow. Its architecture was unlike anything Gandalf had seen in Middle-earth, neither the flowing lines of elven design nor the solid practicality of dwarfish construction, but something older and stranger, with angles that seemed to defy natural geometry and towers that twisted like frozen flames against the sky. "What is this place?" Gandalf murmured, more to himself than to his companion. Grimbeorn shook his head. "The elders say it was built before men came to these lands, by beings neither elf nor dwarf. Some believe it was raised by the servants of the great enemy during the Elder Days, as a stronghold from which to assault the northern realms." Gandalf studied the fortress with a critical eye. There was indeed something of Morgoth's influence in its design, a deliberate perversion of natural forms, a wrongness that disturbed the eye and mind. Yet it was not wholly evil. He could sense layers of purpose in its construction, as if it had been built, abandoned, reclaimed, and repurposed many times over the millennia. "Whatever its origin," he said at last, "it now serves as Nargul's lair. We must proceed with the utmost caution." They approached slowly, alert for any sign of the shadow's presence. The entrance to the fortress was a great archway, its keystone carved with runes in a script so ancient that even Gandalf, with his vast knowledge of languages, could only guess at their meaning. "A warning," he translated haltingly. "And a promise. Here lies bound the winter's heart. Disturb not its slumber, lest eternal cold consume all lands." Grimbeorn's expression darkened. "Too late for warnings. The slumber is already disturbed." "Yes," Gandalf agreed. "But the binding may still hold some power. This fortress was not built merely to house Nargul, but to contain it." They passed beneath the archway into a vast entrance hall. Despite the fortress's partially ruined state, the interior was remarkably preserved, free of snow and ice, the air still and surprisingly warm compared to the bitter cold outside. Pillars of the same black stone rose to support a ceiling lost in shadow. Between them stood statues of warriors in armor of an unfamiliar design, their faces hidden behind visored helms. Each clutched a spear or sword, the weapons pointed downward in an attitude of watchful readiness rather than aggression. "Guardians," Gandalf said softly, running his hand along the base of one statue. "Set here to keep Nargul imprisoned." They failed in their task, then, Grimbeorn observed.